Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's ASDA webinar. The presentation is called Conquering Criticism Through Self-Compassion. We'll be starting momentarily, but first I'd like to do some introductions and instructions for you. My name is Kasia Halko. I'm the facilitator of tonight's webinar. I'm ASDA's marketing manager and one of 13 full-time staff that work here at ASDA. Tonight's presenter is Dr. Jenna Bauer. The webinar is a presentation of ASDA's Wellness Initiative. The goal of the initiative is to equip ASDA members with a variety of resources related to overall wellness, including 5 dimensions in particular: emotional, physical, environmental, occupational, and intellectual. You'll find resources for all of these, as well as links to the wellness centers at your dental school on ASDA's website. This September, ASDA is also celebrating Wellness Month, where members and chapters put a special focus on dental student wellness. After tonight's program, we'll offer another wellness webinar, which will occur next Monday, and information for that is available on ASDA's website. At this time, I'd like to recognize the exclusive sponsor of ASDA's Wellness Initiative. ADA Members Insurance Plans, underwritten by Great West Financial, is committed to your emotional, physical, and financial wellness. That's why they offer disability and life insurance at no cost to ADA student members while you're in dental school. It's easy to request activation of your no-cost coverage at insurance.ada.org/healthy. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's presenter. Dr. Jenna Bauer earned her bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and her master's and doctorate degrees in clinical psychology from Alliant International University, the California School of Professional Psychology in San Francisco. Dr. Bauer has worked with diverse populations in a range of settings, including child and adolescent day treatment and outpatient programs, eating disorder treatment centers, addiction recovery centers, and college counseling centers. She's currently the Assistant Director of Mind-Body Programs at the University of Illinois at Chicago Counseling Center. In addition, she works at Foundations Recovery Network Chicago, leading yoga therapy groups, and she has a small private practice. Dr. Bauer is passionate about promoting mind and body wellness in her work and has pursued many trainings in this area. She's a certified Koru mindfulness teacher, a HeartMath certified practitioner, and a 200-hour certified yoga instructor. She's also attended intensive trainings in mindful self-compassion and trauma-sensitive yoga. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Jenna Bauer.
Hello, Kasia. Thank you for the very warm welcome. I'm very excited to be here presenting to you all tonight. This topic is something that I feel very passionate about. I found it personally very helpful and also, of course, very helpful in the work that I do with my clients and with students. I myself, throughout most of my life, was very self-critical, very hard on myself, and self-compassion was a concept that I hadn't even heard of basically until I was on my postdoctoral residency, and I had a supervisor that was very interested in this and had kind of just learned about some ways to work on adding in self-compassion. And so I really kind of latched onto this concept, found it incredibly helpful, and then was lucky enough in 2015 to do a training with Dr. Kristen Neff and Dr. Christopher Germer on their mindful self-compassion program, which has really influenced a lot of the work that I do now. I do a lot of mindfulness and self-compassion workshops with students at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and so I'm going to share a lot of that same information with you all. So unfortunately, what I've found in working with students is that they tend to have a lot of self-criticism. And this is actually, I found, is really kind of promoted in higher education. As you all know, you're being graded and evaluated at all times. And there can be a lot of kind of social comparisons happening. So you're always kind of looking at maybe your fellow students and thinking, okay, how do I measure up? Am I good enough or not good enough compared to them? And that can really, really enhance someone's internal self-criticism. And what I see with students a lot is what we call imposter syndrome. So this is basically the tendency to kind of feel like you're not good enough, like you're not measuring up, again, comparing yourself to others, basically feeling a little bit like I'm a fraud, and maybe there was some sort of mistake that happened that allowed me into dental school, and at some point someone's going to find me out that I don't really know what I'm doing, and that I'm not qualified for this. And that can really eat away at students' sense of confidence, and it can really undermine what they're trying to do in school and in their future careers. And so although, again, a lot of this self-criticism can be reinforced in school, what we often find is that it starts a long time prior, usually for a lot of people, that a lot of times people first kind of experience criticism, maybe by their parents or caregivers, criticizing them, or maybe even just seeing your parents or caregivers being critical of themselves. And so you see them modeling that behavior, and then you start to do that to yourself. Or maybe you have experiences of being bullied growing up, or maybe have a partner or a friend that mistreats you. And so again, having these external experiences of being criticized often leads people to start to internalize that own inner sense of criticism, and to develop this internal critical voice where they start repeating kind of some of these same critical messages that they've heard from others, until it becomes almost automatic. And people can almost not even realize when they're being critical or hard on themselves, because it becomes so much of the norm of what they do in their day to day. And oftentimes people think, kind of in a misguided way, that being critical of yourself can be helpful, that maybe it's helping you to achieve more, or be better, be more productive, but it really can have a lot of detrimental impacts. So I want to talk next a little about the purpose of self-criticism. So Paul Gilbert in particular, Dr. Paul Gilbert, is a researcher, and he's looked a lot at the evolutionary purpose of self-criticism. So what he's found is self-criticism is really an innate process, and it was designed in a way to help us. So we all have the limbic system, which is also known kind of as our threat defense system. So that's what gets activated when we perceive some sort of threat. That could be external or internal threat, and then that kind of activates the fight or flight response, that we have to kind of do something to fix that so we don't feel that threat. When that system is activated, that's when the stress hormones are released. That's cortisol and adrenaline. And again, this threat defense system can be activated, let's say if someone tries to attack us. It can also be activated if we're criticized by someone else, or if we criticize ourselves. Our brain doesn't know the difference between a threat to our actual life versus an emotional threat by being criticized. It responds in the same way. Those same chemicals are released, that same system is activated. And so according to Paul Gilbert's social mentality theory, he says that when that threat defense system is activated in terms of our social relationships, that served a purpose. So early humans, in order to survive and kind of pass on our genes, we had to exist in part of a group. So we couldn't kind of be off on our own, or it was likely we wouldn't be able to get enough food. We may get killed off by some animal that stalked by and attacked us. So in order to survive, we really needed to stay a part of a group where we had protection from other people and support from other people. And so therefore, as we're in this group, if we did something wrong, maybe we offended someone, made some sort of a mistake, other people were likely to, maybe criticize us, let us know that we stepped out of bounds. And maybe we even kind of recognized that, we felt guilty, maybe we criticized ourselves a little bit. And that prompted us to try to make amends, to repair that relationship, to change our behavior. And that helped to keep us as part of a group. So in that way, that kind of criticism feedback loop was helpful for keeping us surviving. However, humans, as you may know, really have an advanced capacity in our brains to kind of reflect on ourselves, to replay situations, and that really can be helpful. But in terms of self-criticism, it can really work against us. So what happens is it's not just, one scenario where maybe we make a mistake and someone else is upset with us, and so we fix it. What we often do is our brain ruminates on those situations. We replay them. We're basically activating that threat defense system over and over again as we replay this perceived mistake or this flaw or this bad thing about us. And we make ourselves feel upset and stressed time and time again, replaying that situation. So they've actually found in research of individuals who've experienced trauma, the brain responds in the same way, whether we're in the moment of the trauma or whether we're just remembering it. So again, our brains don't know the difference. We're still responding as if the threat is real in that moment, even if we're just remembering that happening. So all those times we're criticizing ourselves, we're beating ourselves up, we're really doing a lot of damage to our system, constantly kind of beating ourselves up for these things. So the good news is that just as self-criticism is innate, self-compassion is also innate. And really the trick is just kind of retraining our brain to be more compassionate. So oftentimes, again, if we're used to being criticized by others, if we start to criticize ourselves a lot, that becomes our default way of working. So what we want to do is try to kind of create a new way of our brains working, to kind of access the mammalian caregiving system. So again, all mammals have the capacity to care for other people, to care for themselves. And again, this serves the evolutionary purpose. If we're caring for others, we're supporting our young, we're staying a part of the group, we're, ensuring that the species is going to go on. And when we activate that caregiving system, when we're either giving care towards others, when others are giving care or love towards us, or when we're even taking care of ourselves, that releases more of the positive hormones, the oxytocin, the opiates, kind of the feel-good hormones, so you can say. So the good thing is that our brains have this amazing capacity called neuroplasticity. So what this is it allows us to basically rewire the brain, the way our brain is working. So if our default has become that self-criticism neural pathway, if we can start to access this other system, this caregiving compassion system, and start to practice more of the self-compassion towards ourselves, that can start to create a new neural pathway in our brain, that when we start to feel bad, when we start to criticize ourselves, instead of going down that critical pathway, we can go down the self-compassion pathway, and that can become our new norm, that can become kind of our automatic response when we're having a hard time, when we're feeling bad, when we're struggling or mess something up. And that can really be helpful and help us to feel a lot better in our day-to-day lives. So I want to take a moment just to have you all reflect a little bit. So to begin, just kind of take a moment to think, how do you talk to yourself when you're having a hard time, when you feel like you made a mistake, when you are thinking about something that you feel like is a flaw of yours, maybe when you're feeling inadequate? Just take a moment to think about the kind of things that you say to yourself, maybe the tone of voice that you use. Is there common language that you use to talk to yourself? Just kind of reflect on that. And now I want you to think about what you say to a good friend, to a loved one, when they come to you and you see them being really critical of themselves. You notice that they're beating themselves up for something that they've done or for some perceived inadequacy. Think about what you say to them, maybe how you reassure them. Think about the tone of voice that you use when you're talking to them. Think about kind of the words that you might say, kind of some of the things, the messages you may give them. And so now kind of notice if there's a difference between the two, between how you talk to yourself and how you may talk to others. For most of us, there's probably going to be a difference. I know for myself, there's a huge difference between kind of my gut instinct of how I'm going to talk to myself and how I'm going to talk to others. For example, when I'm talking to myself, I notice I use a much harder tone of voice, much more blaming language. I kind of consider myself to be completely responsible for whatever happened to go wrong. I don't look at any of the other external factors that may have contributed to the situation. It's really me, and it's me as a person, something kind of fundamental about me that isn't good enough or that messed up. Versus when I'm talking with a friend, with a loved one, or maybe even with a student that I'm working with, I'm noticing I'm much kinder. I have a softer tone of voice. I'm much more reassuring and understanding. I help them to kind of see all the other external factors that may have influenced and contributed to this difficulty that they're dealing with. I kind of remind them that this is, one experience or one small aspect. It doesn't define them as a person. So again, it's really dramatically different how I may respond to other people than how I respond to myself. And this is often true for most people. You're often much more kind to other people than you are to yourself. You're more likely to say things to yourself that you would never say to someone else's face. But somehow it seems okay when we're talking to ourselves like this. But what we really want to do is work to shift this, to be more compassionate towards ourselves. So let's talk a little bit about what self-compassion is. So I like to think of it in terms of the reverse golden rule. So really thinking about how can I start to treat myself the way that I treat other people that I care about? Because that's really what we need to work on. We're very kind and supportive towards others. So how can we start to do that for ourselves as well when we're having a hard time? So really looking at self-compassion as a whole, it's recognizing when we're struggling, when we're feeling bad about ourselves, when we're, wanting to go towards that default of being critical. And in those very times, because we're feeling so bad, because we're struggling, that is exactly when we should actually be treating ourselves with care, with kindness and understanding. That's when we need to be bringing in that compassion piece to help to support us through that difficult time and to move past that difficulty. So there's kind of three primary components that Kristin Neff and Christopher Germer talk about when they refer to self-compassion. And those are mindfulness, common humanity, and self-kindness. So to talk about mindfulness, it's kind of a hot word right now. It's pretty popular. When we're talking about mindfulness as it relates to self-compassion, you're specifically wanting to be aware of when you're struggling, specifically wanting to start to notice when you're defaulting towards that critical talk, when you're starting to go towards beating yourself up. Because if you don't even know when that's happening, if it's become so automatic, you don't even recognize the maybe critical, harsh words that you're saying to yourself, there's no way you can change it. You have to first really be aware, notice when that's happening, and then try to shift towards something else. So they really talk about mindfulness instead of over-identification. So over-identification is, for example, perceiving some sort of flaw in yourself or making some mistake and feeling like that really defines you as a person, like that defines your worth as a person. And so instead of using kind of these experiences or these perceived flaws as defining you, you want to be mindful of when you're struggling with something, but look at it as more as like, okay, this is what's happening right now. I'm feeling this way right now, not this is me as a person always and forever. And so the key question when you're trying to be mindful is to ask yourself, okay, how am I feeling right now? Like, what's going on? How am I talking to myself? Just to try to be aware of what that internal process is. So the next piece is the common humanity piece. So this is basically just kind of acknowledging the shared human experience that everyone has, that everyone, not every person on the face of the earth at some time will make a mistake, will struggle, that no one is perfect. None of us are robots. We are all have imperfections, and we all are going to mess things up from time to time. But that's just part of being human. That it can be painful sometimes to be human. It can be painful to go through these experiences, but we are all in this together. So a lot of times when people start to become critical of themselves, they feel very isolated and alone. Like, I'm the only one. I'm the only one that messed that up. I'm the only one that has this flaw. And it really pulls you away from others. And it takes away your opportunity to really receive support. And so instead of being isolated, you want to remember the common humanity piece, to kind of connect in with others, to feel less alone, to feel like everyone has inevitable blunders in their lives. So really the key question to ask yourself is, how have others struggled or felt similarly before, or had difficult times like these? To kind of cue in on how you can relate to others in that way, how you can maybe reach out to other people for support instead of isolating and maybe hiding and pulling away from other people. So the last component of building self-compassion is the self-kindness piece. And this is really like the heart, the gold of the practice. So this is really treating yourself with that understanding, that care, that kindness. So all those supportive, encouraging words that you're likely to say to a friend when they're having a hard time, you want to start trying to say that to yourself. So instead of turning towards that critical nature, that judgment, you want to treat yourself with kindness. So cueing in, asking yourself, okay, how would I treat a friend or a loved one in this situation? Really trying to think, what am I ultimately needing? What would help me to feel better in this moment? And trying to give that to yourself. So next I want to talk with you about a little bit of the kind of misconceptions or misgivings around self-compassion and some of the research that actually backs up a lot of the positive impacts of self-compassion. And some of these will relate to those dimensions of wellness that Kasha was talking about before that I know they're trying to promote for you all. So one of the first things to look at is that a lot of times people will think, oh, if I'm going to work on my self-compassion, then I'm just going to become really lazy. I'm not going to achieve all the things I want. I'm just going to kind of be indulging myself, and that's not a good thing. But that's actually not true. So what the research has found is that people who are higher in self-compassion actually have improved motivation, that they've looked specifically at individuals who are more compassionate. And what they found is that a lot of these, what they call like handicapping behaviors, that are kind of these self-defeating behaviors that we engage in, such as procrastination, that people who are more compassionate towards themselves are less likely to engage in those behaviors. They're less likely to procrastinate, put things off. They're actually have more drive and more motivation. And they've looked at kind of comparing people that are very perfectionistic and then looking at different levels of self-compassion. And what they found is that people who are more compassionate have lower levels of perfectionism, but they don't have lower levels of standards for themselves. So they still set their standards just as high. They're still trying to achieve just as much as someone who's incredibly perfectionistic. The difference is when you're perfectionistic, you feel like you have to meet that standard. And if you don't, you can really feel horrible about yourself, kind of beat yourself up. And that can lead you to feel really discouraged. Versus if you're more compassionate, you still have those high standards. You're still pushing yourself to achieve as much as you can. But when inevitably you hit a bump in the road, which we all do in our lives, you're better able to keep going. They found that people who are more self-compassionate are less afraid of failure. And when they have a failure experience, they don't get derailed. They're more likely to kind of persist, keep working, keep going, even after a failure experience, than people who are more critical of themselves. So this is actually going to help you achieve even more if you can be compassionate. Ultimately, being more compassionate, building self-compassion is going to help you to increase that drive to better yourself. And it's really going to help you build an internal drive for motivation. So it's not about, I just want to look good or achieve things so others think I look good. It's really an internal sense of motivation that you want to do the best that you can do, that you're trying to reach your highest standards. So I also hear a lot from people that they worry, oh, if I'm just focused on being compassionate towards myself, then aren't I going to become more, just self-centered or self-absorbed? And again, the research has shown that that's actually not the case. That they did a really interesting study looking at couples, and they had both members of the couple rate each other on a realm of different domains. And what they found is individuals who were higher in self-compassion were rated by their partners as more caring, more accepting, more supporting of their partner's autonomy, that they felt more connected to their partners, versus individuals who rated higher in self-criticism. Their partners also rated them as more detached, more controlling, and more domineering. And so that ultimately these couples where there was more self-compassion, there was higher self-compassion, they had greater ratings of satisfaction in their relationships, greater security in their relationships. So if you think about it, although it may seem kind of contradictory, if you work on being more compassionate towards yourself, that's also going to transfer to your relationships with other people, that you're also going to be able to give more care and compassion towards others as well, and ultimately improve your relationships. So next I want to talk about kind of some of the emotional benefits. So a lot of times students come into me and they're saying, I really want to work on building my self-esteem. Like that's what I really need to improve. And so sometimes that can be really helpful, but self-compassion is really different from self-esteem in some key ways. And what some of the research has found is that sometimes self-esteem is not always a good thing, that people who are high in self-esteem have also been found to be sometimes more narcissistic. They can be more prejudiced. They can engage in more bullying and aggressive behaviors, whereas individuals who are high in self-compassion don't have these same kind of negative behaviors. That's not associated with these same negative traits. So in some ways, it may be more helpful to work on increasing your self-compassion than increasing your self-esteem, because the self-compassion has been linked with a lot of emotional benefits. Many, many studies have found that increasing self-compassion helps to decrease depression and decrease anxiety. It also helps specifically with dealing with difficult experiences. So it decreases that rumination that we can do, replaying those difficult times over and over on the one hand, but it also helps us to decrease our avoidance. So sometimes we can tend to want to avoid the difficult things, and when we're more self-compassionate, we're kind of able to find that middle ground where we're not avoiding difficult things, we're also not ruminating on them, we're just kind of being aware of what's happening and then responding with that kindness. So again, self-compassion has been found to be associated with a lot of different facets of greater satisfaction in your life overall. So like increased happiness, increased optimism, increased self-confidence, just general more positive affect when you're more self-compassionate. And specifically, increasing self-compassion has been found to increase emotional intelligence. So people who are more self-compassionate are also have more understanding of their feelings, greater clarity around what's going on for them. They've been found to have greater emotional coping skills. So they can deal with stressors better. And they have a better ability to kind of rebound from negative emotional states. So when they maybe start to feel bad, the idea is that they're activating then this self-compassion and they can bounce back. They can kind of get out of those negative emotional states a little bit easier than people who are lower in self-compassion. So this is, pretty helpful. So they've also looked at some of the physical health benefits of increasing self-compassion. So they've looked a lot at how self-compassion can impact individuals in terms of their body and their eating behaviors. They found that when you're more compassionate towards yourself, you also feel better about your body, and you are increasing your healthy eating behaviors and decreasing a lot of the disordered eating behaviors. They've also done a bunch of studies that looked at self-compassion as it relates to individuals when they're trying to undergo some sort of behavior change. So for example, stopping smoking, or maybe starting a new diet or a new exercise regime. And what they found is that people that are higher in self-compassion are more likely to actually stick with whatever new behavior change they're trying to do. So for example, individuals who are trying to start a new, maybe healthier diet, when they inevitably, at some point, probably slip up and, they want to go out and eat that donut, people who are very critical of themselves tend to beat themselves up after they eat that donut. But then, in order to feel better, they engage in even more emotional eating that's usually outside of this new healthy diet. And so it almost kind of snowballs their sense of progress. Versus people that are more compassionate, they inevitably may slip up, but they're like, okay, I got off track, but I can kind of get back on track now, and they'll go back to whatever behavior change they're trying to make. They're more likely to kind of stick with that and roll with, again, these inevitable slip-ups. So that can really help if you're trying to kind of start a new routine or start a new behavior, to, again, try to practice the self-compassion as you're working on that. So they've also found that increasing your self-compassion helps to reduce your stress, specifically those cortisol, those stress hormones that I mentioned before. Those tend to decrease when you're more compassionate towards yourself. And that can be really helpful for your system, because there's all sorts of negative physical health impacts of having a lot of cortisol in your system. They've also found that individuals who are higher in self-compassion have better sleep. So for most of us, and particularly for those that are lower in self-compassion, when you have a really stressful day, it usually takes you longer to fall asleep. Often you're laying in bed and you're just replaying what happened and kind of thinking about all the stressful things that went on in your day, and it takes you longer to fall asleep. Well, individuals who are high in self-compassion, that doesn't happen for them. They still fall asleep in the same amount of time. It doesn't take them any longer. And in fact, individuals who are higher in self-compassion have also been found to then, when they wake up, they have more alertness and they tend to be in better moods. So again, we all know how important sleep is and how that can impact us. So that can really be a way to just help you feel better overall. So now I want to talk about ways to kind of increase your self-compassion. Now that we've talked about all the great things that come from that, it's important to kind of think about, okay, so how can I start to work on this for myself? So there's a lot of different ways, and I'll go over them in more detail, but some of the ones that I'll hit on is starting to, again, notice when you're kind of defaulting towards that critical self-talk, that inner critic is speaking up in your head, and trying to replace those critical messages with more compassionate phrases, more compassionate self-talk. Another way, if maybe words isn't necessarily connecting with you, is to try to incorporate more self-compassionate activities. So specifically to kind of do something more concrete for yourself when you're feeling bad, but to also just try and incorporate more of these compassionate activities into your week, into your day, to help you feel better overall. You can also try a writing activity. So there's lots of writing activities that can be really helpful. And I'll go over at the end some resources on some websites where they have different writing activities. But one of them is a self-compassionate letter. And so I'll explain that more in detail about how to kind of work on that to help to improve your self-compassion. And then lastly, it can also be really helpful, especially if you like meditation or mindfulness, to practice a self-compassion focused meditation. So again, at the end in the resources, I will show you where there's a lot of different meditations that you can practice at home on your own. And I'll also walk you all through a little meditation in a few moments. So when you're thinking about how to work on building your own self-compassion phrases, you kind of think back to those 3 different components of self-compassion. So when starting out thinking of like the mindfulness component, starting to think of phrases, again, just kind of reflecting what's going on for you right now. So this really sucks. Like I do not feel good right now. Wow, I messed that up, and I'm really feeling upset about it. Just kind of some statement that's reflecting what's happening for you. Kind of just trying to not frame it in a judgmental way, but just really acknowledging what's coming up for you, the difficulty that you're dealing with. And then the next kind of phrase is a common humanity phrase. So again, this is kind of trying to connect in with how we're all in this together. So maybe reminding yourself, okay, anyone who was in this situation, who had all these things to deal with, might have, kind of messed that up or responded in that same way. I'm not alone in this. I know there's people that care about me. Other people screw things up sometimes too. No one's perfect. Kind of reminding yourselves of these phrases so you feel less alone in this, and so that maybe you can connect with others instead of pull away from others. And then lastly, really again, back to the gold of this self-compassionate work is trying to build those self-kindness phrases. So trying to think of some words that are really comforting and reassuring for you. So maybe, can I learn to accept myself as I am? Or reminding yourself, I know I can get through this. This is really hard right now, but I can keep going. Even though I feel like I have this flaw, I know I'm still a good person overall. To really kind of think of what words are going to be most kind and supportive for yourself. So when you're thinking of these phrases, you want to kind of be aware. If you come up with a phrase, you're trying it out, and upon hearing that phrase, immediately you have kind of like a cringe factor, like, "Ooh, that's too mushy for me," or "I don't know about that," then that is not the phrase for you. You really want to try and find phrases that you can buy into. And sometimes, at the beginning, you may only buy into them a little bit, but it has to be something that you can at least somewhat buy into. So it may take some time to really kind of think through, okay, what phrases connect for me? And one way to kind of think about that is to try to reflect on, okay, what would I really want to hear from a friend or a loved one? What kind of things, messages could someone say to me that like it would never get old? I could just hear that up until the day I die, and it would still feel great to hear that. And then try to repeat those things to yourself, thinking about what you're really needing, what you're really wanting, and trying to say some of those messages to yourself. So when you're using the phrases, of course, it's helpful in the moment if you notice that you're starting to be critical of yourself, to try and use your phrases and bring them up in that very moment when you know you're having a hard time. However, it can also be really difficult to do that because, again, we're trying to form a new habit, and that does not just happen overnight. It takes some time and some practice. So what I also recommend is also trying to practice those phrases on a regular basis, even when you're maybe not necessarily feeling so bad. So you can make it a part of your daily routine. So maybe first thing in the morning when you wake up, just kind of repeating your phrases as a nice way to start off your day. Or maybe right before you go to sleep, just kind of repeating your phrases to yourself as a way to just calm down and prepare to go to bed. So again, trying to add them into your daily routine. So you're forming that new neural pathway. You're strengthening that self-compassion pathway in your brain. So another way to work on building your self-compassion is to try and do more concrete activities. And again, with these activities, same as with the phrases, absolutely, definitely try to do a self-compassion activity when you find you're having a difficult time, when you're being hard on yourself, when you're not feeling very good. But it's also helpful just to try to incorporate these into your regular routine. So trying to do something at least once a week, maybe even once a day would be great. And there's lots of different domains that you can kind of look at when you're trying to build in these self-compassion activities. So it could be, something physical, something mental, emotional, relational, or spiritual. So for example, something physical. So let's say you had a really hard day, you're just feeling really stressed out, and maybe you want to come home and take a yoga class in the evening, or maybe treat yourself to a bath, throw in a little bath bomb in the water, kind of enjoy the nice smell. Or maybe you're just feeling really mentally fried. Your mind is just totally worn out and you need to do something to kind of shift your mental state. So maybe you go on YouTube, you find that funny cat video and you just watch that for a couple minutes as a way of just kind of taking a break, taking a little mental breather. And emotionally, so particularly when you're feeling bad emotionally, it can be helpful to try to do something that's going to soothe you or that's going to help conjure up a more helpful, supportive emotion. So maybe listening to your favorite upbeat song, maybe journaling if that helps to kind of release some of those feelings that you may be struggling with. And then the relational component also is really important. So when you're having a hard time, instead of maybe pulling away, reaching out to others, calling a friend, telling them that you're struggling, and then also just incorporating more social activities in your day-to-day. So maybe, joining a meetup group that is a hobby that you really enjoy, or maybe just spending some quality time with your pet, taking your dog for a walk, spending some time snuggling with your cat if you have a pet, to help you feel more connected. And the last one, if you have some sort of spiritual background, trying to kind of connect with that. Or if you don't have any particular spiritual association, just trying to connect with your own inner values. So maybe going and volunteering somewhere, helping someone else. Maybe just taking a walk outside, connecting with nature, or maybe taking some time out to meditate. Kind of doing some of these activities that's a more concrete, active way to be caring and compassionate for yourself. So another thing that you can do that's a writing activity is to try and write a self-compassion letter. So if you're going to do this, you want to first think of some sort of issue that you tend to be critical of in yourself, maybe some sort of flaw or some mistake that you made, something that tends to make you feel bad about yourself. And once you've kind of identified that one thing, you're going to write a letter from the perspective of an imaginary compassionate friend, as if they were writing this letter to you, writing kind of kind, supportive words to you. And if that feels kind of difficult or challenging, if you're not really sure how to take on the perspective of, an imaginary compassionate friend, you can also reverse the script as we talked about before. So think about a close friend, a loved one, if they came to you and they were struggling with that same problem that you were having, and they were being very hard on themselves, trying to write the letter from the perspective of what you would say to them, how you would support them or encourage them as they're dealing with this difficulty. So when you're writing that letter, you really want to include messages, words of understanding, of reassurance, of care. You really want to convey that compassionate friend sees all aspects of you. So they see all your great qualities, they see some of your weaknesses, and they still accept you exactly as you are. Conveying that in that letter, that you are okay just as you are, that they accept you as a whole person. And then if appropriate, you might want to add in some supportive suggestions for change. So I really want to highlight that these should be supportive suggestions. So this is not a good, helpful suggestion to say, well, you failed that test, you really screwed that up, so in the future, you better really just put the nose to the grindstone and work harder, because otherwise you're going to fail again. Not very helpful, not very supportive. So instead, a way to kind of reframe that could be, okay, so you didn't get the grade that you wanted on that test. Maybe you didn't put in as much time as would have been helpful studying for that test. But of course, you weren't feeling well. You had 3 exams that week. And so anyone in that situation might have had a hard time really devoting as much time as they would have liked. However, for the future, maybe you can start week by week, just reviewing a little bit of your notes, of some of the information that you're learning, so that you're more prepared when it comes time for test time, so that you're not trying to cram at the last moment. So that, for example, would be a more supportive suggestion for change that you could write in that letter in a more kind and compassionate tone of voice. So now I want to lead you through a little brief guided self-compassion meditation exercise. So I'm going to turn this around and try and turn the webcam on. So bear with me here for just a moment. Hopefully you should all be seeing me now. All right. So for this self-compassion meditation, just find a comfortable seated position. If it feels okay, you can close your eyes. If you would prefer to keep your eyes open, that's fine too. Just kind of do whatever works best for you. And I'll guide you through what you're going to picture and what you're going to think about as we're practicing this. And as we're practicing the meditation, I'm going to invite you, if it's okay, if it feels all right for you, to try a self-compassion gesture. So this could be maybe placing a hand over your heart, maybe crossing your hands, giving your arms a little rub or a squeeze, maybe placing your hands over your belly, or maybe just holding your hands together again, giving them a little reassuring squeeze. So go ahead and take some posture on now, if that feels okay. If that feels a little hokey or doesn't feel right for you, then you don't have to do it, that's okay. And then if you want, you can close your eyes. I'll close my eyes as I'm guiding you through this. And so to begin, just connect in with your breath. Just notice your inhales and your exhales. And as you're breathing, you can recognize that even this simple act of breathing is a compassionate act. That when we breathe, when we inhale, we're taking into our bodies exactly what we're needing. We're bringing in all that oxygen that our bodies needs. We're nourishing ourselves with every in-breath that we take. And similarly, as we exhale, as we breathe out, we're letting go of anything that we don't need. We're just getting rid of anything that isn't serving us. And as we continue to notice our breathing, you might be aware of the gentle movement of your breath. That as you breathe in and out, there's a slight natural rocking sensation of your body. As your breath comes in and out, that even this motion can be maybe a little soothing for you. And so as you're breathing out, I want you to bring to mind the image of a friend, a family member, a pet, someone that you care about. Someone that you care about, that cares about you in return. And try to hold their image in your mind's eye. And as you breathe out, I want you to think with every exhale, you're breathing out your care and your compassion for them. That as you breathe out, you're breathing out for them. Exhaling, sending all that care that you have over towards them. And then as you inhale, I want you to imagine that you can breathe in all the care, the love that they have for you. That with every inhalation that you take, you're breathing in for you all their compassion. Breathing in for you. And then breathing out for them. Taking just a few moments, allowing the compassion to flow back and forth into you on the inhale, and then out to them on the exhale. Maybe silently repeating, in for me, out for you. In for me, out for you. Taking just a few more breaths to really savor this experience. And then when you feel ready, you can gently open your eyes and come back into the room. So now I just want to go over a few resources for you. There's a check out if you're interested in learning more about self-compassion. So I referenced Kristin Neff and Christopher Germer, and their websites are on here. They have, again, a lot of writing activities. They also have a lot of guided meditations that you can look at right through their website. So I really recommend that. I also recommend checking out the Compassionate Mind Foundation. That's by Dr. Paul Gilbert, who's based out of the UK. Stanford Medicine also has an entire department that's devoted just towards research and education on compassion and altruistic behavior. So I really recommend, once again, looking into that as well. I've also listed a couple books that I highly recommend. The first one is the Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook. So that has a lot of practical activities for helping to build more compassion in. And then the bottom two is a book written by Kristin Neff and then another book by Christopher Germer that also explain a lot more about self-compassion, that go over some practical activities. Both of those books are great. And at the very bottom is a link to the self-compassion test. So this is a test designed by Kristin Neff. I think it's just 26 questions, if I remember correctly. And
Dr. Bauer, I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you share your screen?
Oh, I'm so sorry about that. Let me see. Can you see it now?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay. Can you still see it?
Yes.
There we go. Okay. So yeah, at the bottom down here is the self-compassion test. So that's something I highly recommend. Again, you check out to kind of get a baseline of where you're at, whether you tend to be more critical, more compassionate. And then you can also, maybe after some time, if you practice some of these self-compassion exercises, you can take the test again and maybe see if there's anything that's shifted, kind of try to get a new assessment of where you're at. So again, I recommend all these resources if you want additional knowledge or additional work on building your self-compassion. So now I want to open it up, turn it back over to Kasha, open up for any questions that people may have.
Wonderful. Dr. Bauer, thank you so much for that presentation. I'm going to, if you have questions, you can type them into the chat box, which is on the right-hand side of the screen. So if you have a question, go ahead and type it in. And we'll wait for a second to give you all an opportunity to do so. So Dr. Bauer, I have one question which talks about the difference between self-compassion and forgiveness. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between the two?
Sure, absolutely. So how I think about the difference between the two is self-forgiveness can be a component of self-compassion, but it's kind of more specific. So while, again, a lot of times when we're being hard on ourselves, it may be around something that we feel like we messed up or a mistake that we made. And part of being compassionate towards ourselves can be forgiving ourselves for that experience. But we also want to do more than that. So again, we want to hit on all the different dimensions, that it's not just forgiving ourselves, but really trying to be kind and caring for ourselves, trying to connect with others. So kind of forgiveness is maybe more of like, I guess, an action, you could say, and self-compassion is kind of the overall attitude and how you're treating yourself and a broader perspective for what you can do.
Terrific, thank you. Our next question is about podcasts. If someone doesn't have time, for example, to read a book and wants to listen to a podcast during their commute, what's a podcast that you recommend on this topic?
That is a great question. If you're trying to listen to something brief on your commute, I believe that Kristen Neff and also Christopher Germer, I'm not totally sure about him, but definitely Kristen Neff has some shorter kind of videos or things that you can tune into. In terms of like ongoing podcasts, that the entire podcast is devoted to self-compassion, I'm not completely familiar off the top of my head, but if you want, I can look into that. You can send me an email. My email's on there, and I can see what I can find. I can give you more information on
that. If you also want, you can send some of that by email to me at the office, and I can send a follow-up email to all the participants tonight. And then we have another question, which is about apps. Are there apps that you recommend?
Yes. So one of the apps that I recommend that has some kind of meditation activities that are helpful with this is the Insight Timer. So it's a more general app for mindfulness and meditation, but they have a lot of guided meditations. And so if you scroll down through those, I believe they have some on self-compassion, or they may have some on what they call it like loving kindness, which is basically very similar to self-compassion. And so you can link to some of their guided meditations through that as well. That's I love that app. It's a really great app.
Okay, terrific. It looks like that's all the questions we have for tonight, and we're coming up on time. So I'm going to give just a few more seconds if someone wants to add a question to the question box. But in the meanwhile, I'd also like to really thank you for a really comprehensive and interesting presentation today. I hope that everybody enjoyed it. I know I certainly did. We'll wrap up Q&A right now. And so having thanked Dr. Bauer for her presentation, I also want to thank everyone here for participating tonight and listening. The next webinar that ASDA will have in our wellness series will take place on Monday, September 17th. The topic you see there on the screen is about mind-body wellness in dental school. And the presenter is Dr. Christina Paston, who is the Director of Mind-Body Wellness at Tufts Dental School. I encourage you to register on your own or with your chapter. I also want to recognize again tonight's sponsor, the ADA Student Members Insurance Plans underwritten by Great West Financial. We thank them for their support of ASDA's entire wellness initiative. Finally, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. You will be receiving an email in about an hour with a link to a short survey. It takes just 3 minutes to complete, and tell us what you thought about tonight's presentation and any other topics you would like ASDA to present on in the future. One of you who completes the evaluation will be randomly selected to receive a prize pack of ASDA Wellness swag, so I encourage you to take the 3 minutes and complete the evaluation. This program was recorded and it will be posted on ASDA's website and YouTube channel by early next week. I'd like to thank you all for participating, and good night.